The sun cast long shadows through the tall windows of the Copenhagen Community Music Center as Henrik Larsson arranged chairs in a semicircle around the grand piano. Rain tapped gently against the glass, creating a soothing rhythm that matched his movements. At 56, Henrik had spent over 30 years teaching piano, his passion for music never fading despite the countless students who had passed through his classroom. He glanced at the clock on the wall. 10 minutes until his community workshop began. Henrik ran his fingers through his salt and pepper hair and straightened his tweed jacket, a habit from his conservatory days. The workshop was open to anyone interested in piano, regardless of skill level, a program Henrik had fought to establish. His colleagues had argued that mixing beginners with more advanced players would be chaotic, but Henrik believed in the power of shared learning spaces. "Need any help with those chairs, Professor?" asked Lisa, the center's receptionist, poking her head through the doorway. "No, thank you. I'm nearly finished," Henrik replied, placing the last chair in position. "How many people have signed up today?" 12, Lisa said, consulting her clipboard. "A couple of regulars canceled because of the weather, but we had 3 new registrations this morning." Henrik nodded, pleased. 12 was a good number, enough to create a lively atmosphere, but small enough for individual attention. He walked to the piano and lifted the lid, running his hand lovingly across the polished black surface. This wasn't the finest instrument he'd played. That honor belonged to the Steinway and the Royal Danish Academy of Music. But it had a warm, rich tone that Henrik had come to appreciate. The first participants began to arrive, shaking umbrellas and removing rain jackets. Henrik greeted each one by name. Paul, the retired doctor who had taken up piano in his 70s. Astrid, the teenage prodigy preparing for conservatory auditions. Niels and Katrina, the middle-aged couple who had met in his class 3 years ago. Henrik knew their stories, their strengths, their struggles with particular techniques. At exactly 2 o'clock, Henrik clapped his hands once, a signal that the workshop was about to begin. He scanned the room, mentally taking attendance when the door opened quietly, and a woman he didn't recognize slipped in. She appeared to be in her 60s, with silver-streaked hair pulled back in a simple bun. Her clothes were understated, a navy blue cardigan over a light blue blouse, gray trousers, and sensible shoes. There was nothing remarkable about her appearance, yet something in her bearing caught Henrik's attention. She carried herself with quiet dignity, her posture perfect even as she tried to make herself inconspicuous, taking a seat in the back row. "Welcome, everyone," Henrik said, his voice filling the room with practiced ease. "I see some new faces today. Let's begin with introductions." Around the circle they went, each person sharing their name and a bit about their piano journey. When it came to the woman in the back, she smiled softly. "I'm Margaret," she said simply. Her voice was warm but measured, with the cultured accent of someone well-educated. "I played as a child but haven't touched a piano in many years. I hope to reconnect with the joy it once gave me." Henrik nodded encouragingly. "Welcome, Margaret. We're happy to have you. There's no pressure here, just a shared love of music." He turned to the piano, playing a few chords to focus the group's attention. "Today we'll be exploring the concept of dynamics, how the force with which we press the keys affects not just volume, but the emotional quality of the music." Henrik's hands danced across the keyboard, demonstrating pianissimo passages that barely whispered in the air, then building to thunderous fortissimo sections that filled the room. When he finished the demonstration, he looked up to see Margaret watching intently, her eyes bright with appreciation. "Now," Henrik said, standing. "Who would like to try first?" Paul volunteered, as he often did, his enthusiasm compensating for his technical limitations. Henrik guided him patiently, suggesting adjustments to his hand position and pressure. One by one, the participants took their turns, Henrik offering personalized feedback to each. Throughout these exchanges, Henrik noticed Margaret observing carefully, occasionally nodding to herself as if confirming something she already knew. Unlike some beginners who seemed intimidated, she appeared to be absorbing everything, making mental notes. During a short break, while others chatted and helped themselves to coffee from the back table, Henrik approached Margaret. "How are you finding the workshop so far?" he asked. "Illuminating," she replied with a genuine smile. "Your explanations are very clear. You have a gift for teaching." "Thank you," Henrik said, surprised by her perceptiveness. "Have you attended music workshops before?" Not for many years, Margaret replied. My life took a different direction and music became, well, something I enjoyed as a listener rather than a participant. There was something in her tone, a hint of wistfulness perhaps, that intrigued Henrik. Before he could inquire further, Lisa appeared at his elbow. Professor Larson, the director would like a word when you have a moment. Henrik excused himself, promising to return shortly. As he spoke briefly with the director about an upcoming fundraiser, his eyes drifted back to the classroom. Through the glass panel in the door, he could see Margaret had moved to sit beside Astrid, the young prodigy. They seemed engaged in earnest conversation, Margaret listening intently as Astrid gesticulated enthusiastically, likely explaining some technical aspect of a piece she was working on. When Henrik returned, he asked for a volunteer to demonstrate a challenging passage from a Debussy piece. After a moment of hesitation among the group, he pointed to Margaret. Perhaps our newest member would like to try? No pressure, just a few measures to demonstrate the concept we've been discussing. A flicker of something. Amusement? Apprehension? Crossed Margaret's face. I'm not sure I'd be the best choice, she said softly. Nonsense, Henrik said encouragingly. This is a space for learning. Mistakes are not just allowed but expected. It was a phrase he often used with nervous students. Margaret looked around the room, where faces showed nothing but friendly support. With a slight nod, she rose and approached the piano. Which part would you like me to play? She asked, her voice betraying no nervousness. Henrik opened the sheet music to Claire de Lune and pointed to a particular passage. Just this section if you're comfortable. Focus on the dynamic contrast we discussed. Margaret settled on the bench, adjusting its height with practiced ease, a movement that didn't escape Henrik's notice. She studied the music for a moment, then placed her hands on the keys. Her fingers hovered there briefly as if reacquainting themselves with an old friend. The room fell silent in anticipation. Outside, the rain had stopped, and a shaft of sunlight broke through the clouds, illuminating the piano and the woman seated at it in a warm glow. Margaret began to play. The first notes were tentative, as might be expected from someone returning to an instrument after a long absence. But within moments, her fingers found their confidence, moving with increasing fluidity across the keys. Her touch was delicate yet assured, coaxing from the piano a sound that made Henrik catch his breath. This was not the playing of someone who hadn't touched a piano in years. The subtle control of dynamics. The phrasing that respected Debussy's intentions while adding a personal interpretation. These spoke of deep musical understanding. Henrik found himself moving closer, drawn by the unexpected beauty of her performance. The other participants sat transfixed, the usual rustling and whispers completely absent. Even Astrid, usually critical of others' playing, watched with unguarded admiration. When Margaret finished the passage, the room remained silent for a beat before erupting in spontaneous applause. She looked up, seeming almost surprised to find herself in a classroom surrounded by strangers. A faint blush colored her cheeks. That was, Henrik began, then paused, searching for words that wouldn't embarrass her. You play with remarkable sensitivity. I think we've all learned something from your demonstration. Margaret inclined her head slightly in acknowledgement of the compliment. The piano remembers even when we think we've forgotten, she said quietly. As she returned to her seat, Henrik noticed how the other participants looked at her with new interest and respect. He had intended to move on to the next exercise, but found himself wanting to know more about this mysterious woman, whose humble self-description had so drastically understated her abilities. The remainder of the workshop passed quickly, with a new energy in the room. When the session ended, participants gathered their belongings, several stopping to chat with Margareta, who responded with warm politeness to their questions and compliments. Henrik was speaking with Niels and Katrina when he noticed Margareta preparing to leave. Excuse me, he said to the couple, then quickly crossed the room. Margaret, he called softly. She turned, her hand already on the doorknob. I hope you'll return next week. Your presence added something special to our group today. She smiled, a genuine warmth reaching her eyes. I'd like that very much, Professor Larson. This afternoon has been a gift I didn't know I needed. As she stepped into the hallway, Henrik caught a glimpse of a man in a dark suit waiting at a discreet distance. He straightened perceptibly as Margaret approached, and they exchanged a few words before walking together toward the exit. Henrik returned to tidying the classroom, his mind replaying Margaret's performance. There was something familiar about her style, though he couldn't quite place it. Perhaps she had studied with someone he knew? In 30 years of teaching, Henrik had connections throughout the European classical music world. As he closed the piano lid, Lise appeared in the doorway again, her expression unusually animated. "Professor, do you know who that woman was? The new one in your class today?" "Margaret," Henrik replied, gathering sheet music. "She didn't mention her surname." Lisa's eyes widened. One of the security guards recognized her as she was leaving. He used to work at the palace and said Henrik stopped what he was doing. His full attention now on Lisa's words and the extraordinary possibility they suggested. Henrik stared at Lisa, his mind struggling to process what she had just told him. "The palace?" he repeated. "You can't possibly mean Queen Margaret," Lise whispered, though they were alone in the room. The guard is absolutely certain. He recognized her immediately, even without the usual formality. Henrik sank onto the piano bench. That's impossible," he said. But even as the words left his mouth, his mind was racing back through the afternoon, reassessing every interaction, every observation in this new light, the perfect posture, the cultured accent, the man waiting in the hallway, not a husband or friend, but a security detail. And most telling of all, the piano playing that revealed years of professional training, despite her modest claim of being a lapsed amateur. Why would the Queen of Denmark attend a community piano workshop? Henrik asked, more to himself than to Lisa. And without any announcement or security visible in the room? Lisa shrugged, her excitement barely contained. "She's known for doing unconventional things sometimes. Remember when she designed those ballet costumes for the Royal Danish Ballet? Or her illustrations for that edition of Lord of the Rings? Maybe this is just another of her artistic interests." Henrik nodded slowly. The Queen's love of the arts was well documented. Still, there was a vast difference between pursuing creative projects within royal circles and sitting anonymously in a public class. If it really was her, and I'm not entirely convinced she clearly wanted to participate without the burden of her title, Henrik said firmly, "we should respect that wish." "Of course," Lise agreed, though her expression suggested she was already imagining telling this story to friends. "But if she returns next week—" "If she returns," Henrik interrupted, "she will be treated exactly as any other student. Is that clear?" Lise nodded, properly chastened. "Yes, Professor." After Lisa left, Henrik remained seated at the piano, his fingers absently tracing patterns on the keys. Could it really have been the Queen? And if so, what had brought her to his humble workshop? Throughout the week that followed, Henrik found his thoughts returning repeatedly to the mysterious Margaret. He had never been particularly interested in royal affairs, viewing the monarchy as a respected but distant institution. Now he found himself paying attention when the Queen's name was mentioned on the radio, or when her image appeared in the newspaper. In one article about an upcoming state visit, there was a photograph of her at a diplomatic reception. Henrik studied it carefully. The woman in the photograph wore an elegant gown and a diamond tiara, her hair styled formally, her expression composed and regal as she greeted foreign dignitaries. It was difficult to connect this image with the plainly dressed woman who had sat quietly in his classroom. And yet, looking at the eyes in the photograph, intelligent, observant, with a hint of warmth beneath the formal demeanor, Henrik felt a jolt of recognition. By Thursday, Henrik had convinced himself that it had been a case of mistaken identity. The security guard must have been wrong. The alternative, that he had casually instructed the monarch to demonstrate a Debussy piece, was simply too extraordinary to believe. When Sunday afternoon arrived, Henrik prepared for his workshop with particular care, though he told himself it was no different from any other week. He arrived early, making sure the room was tidy, the chairs arranged perfectly, fresh flowers on the small table by the door, a touch he didn't usually bother with. The regular participants began to arrive. Paul brought Danish pastries to share. Astrid wanted to discuss a difficult passage in a Chopin nocturne she was preparing for a recital. Niels and Katrina were planning their wedding, and asked if Henrik would help select music for the ceremony. At precisely 2 o'clock, Henrik called the class to order. He glanced toward the back row, empty. Suppressing a feeling that might have been disappointment, he began the day's lesson on articulation techniques. 10 minutes later, the door opened quietly. Henrik looked up, his sentence trailing off mid-word. Margaret stood in the doorway, slightly out of breath as if she had hurried. Today she wore a simple green dress with a patterned scarf at her neck. Her hair was arranged the same way as before in a practical bun, though Henrik thought he detected more careful attention to her appearance. "I apologize for my tardiness," she said, her voice carrying that same quiet authority he had noticed before. "Please continue." Henrik nodded, gesturing to an empty chair. "We're discussing the difference between legato and staccato techniques. Please join us." As Margaret took her seat, Henrik noticed several participants exchanging glances and whispers. Word had spread, it seemed. He cleared his throat loudly, drawing attention back to the lesson. Throughout the workshop, Henrik made a conscious effort to treat Margaret exactly as he would any other student. No special attention, but no deliberate avoidance either. When it came time for individual practice, he moved around the room as usual, offering guidance and corrections. When he reached Margaret, she was working on a simple Bach minuet he had provided for the class to practice articulation. "May I?" he asked, gesturing to the empty chair beside her. She nodded, shifting slightly to make room. "Your legato is beautiful," Henrik said honestly. "But notice here," he pointed to a particular measure. Bach intended these notes to be more distinctly separated. Try it with a bit more space between each note. Margaret attempted the passage again, adjusting her technique according to his suggestion. "The improvement was immediate, much better," Henrik said. "You have a natural musicality, but sometimes technique requires a more deliberate approach." "Thank you," she replied. "It's been so long since I've had proper instruction. One forgets the details over time." There was an opening in her comment, an invitation to ask about her background. Henrik hesitated, then decided on a direct approach. "Margaret," he said quietly, ensuring their conversation remained private despite the busy room, "I hope you'll forgive my forwardness, but I find myself curious. You play with remarkable skill for someone who claims to be out of practice, and there's been some speculation about your identity." A small smile played at the corners of her mouth. "Has there?" "A former palace security guard believes he recognized you," Henrik continued, feeling increasingly uncomfortable but unable to stop himself. "He suggests you might be, well, royalty." Margaret's expression remained composed, though Henrik thought he detected a flash of resignation in her eyes. "And if I were?" she asked softly. Henrik considered the question carefully. "If you were, I would wonder why Denmark's monarch would choose to spend her Sunday afternoons in a community piano workshop, when she presumably has access to the finest private instructors in Europe." Margaret looked down at the piano keys, running her fingers lightly over them without pressing down. "Perhaps this monarch, if she existed, might sometimes wish to experience life without the weight of a crown. To sit in a room where the music matters more than the title. To make mistakes without them becoming matters of state gossip." Henrik nodded slowly, understanding dawning. "And perhaps she might appreciate being treated as just another student, rather than as a royal personage." "Perhaps," Margaret agreed, meeting his gaze directly now, though she would understand if that proved difficult given the circumstances. Henrik straightened his shoulders. "Well, as it happens, in this classroom I am the authority on one subject only, piano, and in that subject even queens have something to learn. Your Bach needs work, Margaret. Shall we continue?" The smile that bloomed across her face was genuine and warm. "Please, I'm here to learn." For the remainder of the class, they maintained the fiction that nothing unusual had been acknowledged. Henrik corrected her hand position just as he did with Paul. He praised her progress just as he did with Astrid. He assigned her homework just as he did with everyone else. As the workshop drew to a close, Henrik announced the focus for the following week and reminded everyone to practice at least 30 minutes daily. Participants began gathering their belongings, several casting curious glances toward Margaret, who was carefully placing sheet music into a simple leather folder. "Professor Larson," she said, as he passed by her chair. "Might I have a word in private?" Henrik nodded, leading her to a small office adjacent to the classroom. He closed the door, suddenly acutely aware that he was alone with the Queen of Denmark in a room barely larger than a closet, with a desk cluttered with music books and student records. "I wanted to thank you," Margaret said, "for your discretion and your ordinary treatment. Both are rarities in my life." "I'm just doing my job," Henrik replied honestly. "Teaching piano is about the music, not about who's playing it. Nevertheless, I appreciate it." She paused, seeming to consider her next words carefully. "I would like to continue attending your workshops if that's acceptable, but I understand if my presence creates complications." Henrik thought about the whispers, the sidelong glances, the distraction her identity might cause. Then he thought about the genuine joy he had seen on her face when she played, the earnest attention she gave to his instruction. "You are welcome here as a student of piano," he said firmly. "Royal or not, that's all that matters within these walls." Relief softened her features. "Thank you. But I do have one question, if I may," Henrik added. Margaret tilted her head slightly, granting permission. "Why this particular workshop? There are more prestigious programs, even private instructors who would come to the palace." Margaret smiled, a hint of mischief in her expression. "I read a review of a concert you gave 5 years ago at the Royal Danish Academy. The critic wrote that you played with technical precision that never sacrificed emotional truth. I've attended many performances where one was sacrificed for the other. I wanted to learn from someone who understood that both are necessary." Henrik felt a flush of pride at her words. "I shall try to live up to that assessment in my teaching as well as my playing." "I have no doubt you will," Margaret said. She glanced at her watch. "I should go. My security detail becomes anxious when I linger too long." As if summoned by her words, there was a polite knock at the door. Henrik opened it to find the same man in the dark suit from the previous week standing in the hallway, his expression professionally neutral. "Your Maj," he began, then caught himself. "Madam, the car is waiting." "Thank you, Thomas," Margaret said. "I'll be right there." The man nodded and stepped back, maintaining a respectful distance. Margaret turned back to Henrik. "Until next Sunday, Professor." "Until Sunday," Henrik agreed. "And don't forget to practice your Bach. Queen or not, I expect improvement." A genuine laugh escaped her, brightening her entire face. "I wouldn't dare disappoint you." As she walked away, accompanied by her silent guardian, Henrik felt as if the small office had suddenly grown larger and emptier at the same time. He sat at his desk, pulling a blank sheet of staff paper toward him. Perhaps it was time to compose again, something he hadn't done in years. Something about unexpected encounters and the democracy of music. Something about how a classroom could become, for a few hours, a small kingdom where the only royalty that mattered was Bach, Beethoven, and Chopin. Outside, the afternoon sun caught the departing figure of Margaret as she stepped into a nondescript black car, momentarily illuminating her in gold before the door closed and the vehicle pulled away from the curb, carrying its remarkable passenger back to a world Henrik could only imagine. The following weeks fell into a rhythm that began to feel almost normal. Every Sunday at 2 o'clock, Margaret would arrive at the music center, sometimes precisely on time, occasionally a few minutes late if royal duties had interfered. She would take her place among the other students, participate in the group lessons, accept Henrik's critiques, and practice diligently. Word had spread throughout the center about their royal student, but after the initial excitement, a respectful understanding developed. Within the walls of the classroom, she was simply Margaret, a dedicated piano student. Outside, she resumed her duties as queen, a transition marked only by the waiting car and the watchful presence of Thomas, her security detail. On the 4th Sunday, Henrik noticed Margaret seemed tired. There were shadows beneath her eyes, and her usually perfect posture showed the slightest hint of strain. When the class broke into smaller groups to practice, he approached her. "Everything all right?" he asked quietly. Margaret smiled, though it didn't quite reach her eyes. "Just a busy week. 3 state dinners, a parliamentary crisis, and a visit from the Swedish royal family." Henrik nodded, trying to imagine how she balanced such responsibilities with her dedication to their weekly lessons. "Your Chopin etude can wait if you'd prefer to rest today." "No," she said firmly. "This is my respite, Henrik. Please don't treat me differently, especially not today." It was the first time she had used his first name, a small breach in the formality they had maintained despite the growing ease between them. Henrik nodded, understanding that perhaps today, more than ever, she needed the normalcy of being just another student. "Very well," he said. "In that case, your left hand is too heavy and measures 16 through 24. Again, please." She smiled gratefully and returned to the piece. Focusing entirely on the music, the weight of her crown temporarily set aside. As autumn deepened into winter, Margaret's progress accelerated. Her natural talent combined with what Henrik discovered was a rigorous personal practice schedule, usually very early in the morning. "Before state papers require my attention," she explained, led to remarkable improvement. Soon she was playing pieces that challenged even Astrid, the young prodigy. The dynamic of the class shifted subtly. Initially, the other students had been starstruck, then cautiously friendly, and finally genuinely accepting. Paul often saved a Danish pastry specifically for our Margaret. Astrid sought her opinion on interpretative questions. Niels and Katrina asked if she might play a piece at their wedding, a request she gently declined with sincere regret, explaining that her presence would inevitably overshadow their special day. One Sunday in early December, Henrik announced a small recital for the winter solstice, where each student would perform a piece of their choosing for the others, followed by a modest celebration. Nothing formal, he assured them, just a chance to share our progress and enjoy some music together before the holiday break. After class, Margaret lingered, waiting until the others had left before approaching Henrik. "About the recital," she began, her expression troubled. "I'm not sure it would be wise for me to participate." Henrik looked up from the sheet music he was organizing. "Why not? Your Schubert impromptu is coming along beautifully." "It's not about the music," she said, twisting her simple gold wedding band, a gesture Henrik had noticed she made when uncomfortable. "My presence at a public recital would change the nature of the event. There would be security concerns, protocol issues. It wouldn't be the simple gathering you envision." Henrik considered this. She was right, of course. A public appearance by the Queen, even in this informal setting, would transform the event entirely. "What if it weren't public?" he suggested. "What if we held it at my home instead of the center? Just our small group, no publicity, no announcements." Margaret looked doubtful. "Your home? I have a piano. Not as fine as the one here, but adequate. And enough space for our little group." He smiled. "Think of it as a private musical salon like in the old days when musicians played for small gatherings in people's homes. Your security would need to inspect the location beforehand," Margaret said, but Henrik could see she was warming to the idea. "And Thomas would insist on being present, though he can be discreet." "Of course, whatever is necessary." Henrik hesitated, then added, "I think it would mean a lot to the others if you were there. You've become an important part of our little community." Something in his words seemed to touch her. Her expression softened and she nodded. "Very well. I'll speak to my staff about the arrangements." The following week, Henrik distributed handwritten invitations with his home address and instructions to arrive at different times, staggered to avoid drawing attention. Margaret would arrive last after everyone was settled. When the day of the recital arrived, Henrik spent the morning preparing his apartment. He lived in a modest building in a quiet neighborhood, his second-floor flat filled with books, records, and the upright Yamaha piano that had been his companion for 20 years. He cleaned thoroughly, arranged chairs in a semicircle around the piano, and prepared simple refreshments, nothing extravagant but presented with care. At noon, a team of security personnel arrived to inspect the apartment, checking windows, exits, and sightlines with professional efficiency. Thomas supervised, occasionally asking questions about the expected attendees and schedule. "Will there be any outside staff?" "Catering?" he asked. Henrik shook his head. "Just myself and the students from our Sunday class. 7 people in total, including Her Majesty." Thomas nodded, making notes. "The car will arrive at the back entrance at 3:45. We'll bring Her Majesty up through the service stairs to avoid the main lobby." "Is all this really necessary?" Henrik asked, gesturing to the men examining his kitchen cabinets and bathroom. Thomas's expression remained impassive. "Her Majesty has chosen to maintain a lower profile for these lessons, but her safety cannot be compromised. This is standard procedure for any unofficial appearance." By 3 o'clock, the security team had departed, leaving only Thomas stationed discreetly in the hallway outside. Henrik's students began to arrive. First Paul, then Astrid, followed by Niels and Katrina together, and finally Lisa, who had been invited as both staff from the center and an amateur pianist herself. At precisely 3:47, there was a soft knock at the door. Henrik opened it to find Margaret standing beside Thomas, wearing a simple blue dress and carrying a small gift bag. "Welcome," Henrik said, suddenly feeling the strangeness of having the Queen of Denmark on his doorstep. "Thank you for having me," she replied, stepping inside and handing him the bag. "Just a small token of appreciation for hosting us." Inside was a bottle of fine cognac and a handwritten note that Henrik would read later. For musical evenings when the world grows quiet, the recital began casually, with Paul volunteering to go first to get the mistakes out of the way early, as he joked. His performance of a simple Mozart sonatina was earnest if imperfect, and everyone applauded warmly when he finished. Astrid played next, her technique flawless as she performed a challenging Liszt etude. Niels and Katrina had prepared a duet, their hands moving in perfect coordination across the keyboard, their happiness in playing together evident in their matching smiles. Lisa surprised everyone with a jazz arrangement of a classical piece, bringing a lightness to the gathering. When it was Margaret's turn, she approached the piano with the same quiet confidence she showed in everything. "I've chosen Schubert's Impromptu in G-flat major," she said simply. "It's a piece I loved in my youth but haven't played in many years. Henrik has helped me rediscover it." As she began to play, Henrik was struck by how much her technique had improved over the weeks. But more than that, he noticed how she seemed to lose herself in the music, her royal identity slipping away completely as her fingers danced across the keys. The piece's flowing melody filled his small apartment, transforming the modest space into something grander, not with pomp or ceremony, but with genuine beauty. When she finished, there was a moment of perfect silence before the applause began. Henrik saw tears in Katrina's eyes, and even Thomas, standing quietly by the door, looked moved. "That was lovely," Henrik said when the applause died down. "You've captured the essence of Schubert perfectly, that balance between melancholy and hope." Margaret inclined her head in acknowledgement of the compliment. "It's all in the music. I'm merely the vessel." "And now," Paul announced, raising his glass, "a toast to our teacher, who has brought us all together and convinced us that we can make music worth hearing." Everyone raised their glasses, and Henrik felt a warmth that had nothing to do with the central heating in his apartment. This diverse group of people, from different backgrounds, different generations, different walks of life, had formed a true community through their shared love of music. After the toast, the formal recital structure dissolved into a relaxed gathering. Paul told stories about his medical career. Astrid discussed her conservatory applications. Niels and Katrina shared wedding plans. Throughout it all, Margaret participated fully, asking questions, offering suggestions, laughing at jokes, not as a queen observing her subjects, but as a friend enjoying good company. As the evening progressed, Henrik found himself sitting beside Margaret on his worn sofa, while the others clustered around the refreshment table. "Thank you," she said quietly. "This evening has been a gift." "I should be thanking you," Henrik replied. "Your presence has transformed our little group." Margaret shook her head slightly. "No, you don't understand. In my position, genuine connection is rare. People see the crown, not the person wearing it. Here, with these good people, with you." She paused, searching for words. "Here I am seen as myself. The music doesn't care about titles. Neither do you." Henrik was silent for a moment, touched by her candor. "Music is the great equalizer," he said finally. "Bach doesn't play differently for queens than for commoners." "No," she agreed with a small smile. "He demands the same dedication from us all." Across the room, Paul had convinced Astrid to play a folk tune, and soon everyone was clapping along to the lively rhythm. In that moment, watching Margaret's face light up with simple joy, Henrik understood what these Sunday afternoons truly meant to her. Not just a chance to play piano, but a rare opportunity to experience life unfiltered by her royal role. As the clock approached 7, Thomas discreetly caught Margaret's eye, signaling that it was time to leave. She nodded almost imperceptibly, then turned to Henrik. "I should go. Thank you again for this evening." "Until next Sunday?" Henrik asked. "Until Sunday," she confirmed, rising. "Though I'll be practicing my Chopin etude every day until then. I wouldn't want to disappoint my teacher." When she had gone, the apartment seemed smaller somehow, despite having one fewer person in it. Henrik began tidying up, helped by the others who insisted on washing glasses and rearranging furniture before they departed. Later, alone in his apartment, Henrik sat at his piano, his fingers finding the opening notes of the Schubert impromptu Margareta had played. The melody hung in the air, a lingering presence that somehow made solitude feel less lonely. January brought heavy snow to Copenhagen, blanketing the city in white and slowing its usual pace. Henrik's Sunday workshops continued despite the weather, though attendance sometimes dwindled when the roads were particularly treacherous. Margaret, however, never missed a session. Her car, equipped for winter conditions and driven by skilled royal chauffeurs, arrived punctually each week, a testament to her commitment. As the new year progressed, Henrik noticed subtle changes in their dynamic. Margaret began to share more personal stories, carefully edited, he suspected, but genuine nonetheless. He learned about her childhood love of music, encouraged by her father. She spoke of practicing piano in various palaces and embassies around the world, finding familiar comfort in different instruments during diplomatic travels. In turn, Henrik found himself revealing parts of his own life he rarely discussed with students. His early dreams of becoming a concert pianist, the wrist injury that had redirected his path toward teaching, his brief marriage in his 20s that had ended amicably but left him with a lingering solitude. "Do you regret it?" Margareta asked one day after class as they discussed his career path. "Not pursuing performance?" Henrik considered the question seriously. "Sometimes when I attend concerts at the Royal Academy, I imagine myself on that stage. But then I think of all the students I've taught over 30 years. How many have gone on to find their own musical paths? Teaching has its own rewards." Margaret nodded thoughtfully. "I understand. There are moments I wonder what life might have been like had I been born into a different family, what I might have pursued." "Music?" Henrik suggested. "Perhaps," she smiled. "Or archaeology. I was fascinated by ancient civilizations as a girl. But we rarely get to choose our most significant roles in life, do we?" The question lingered between them, philosophical rather than melancholy. Neither of them were people who dwelled on what might have been, yet both understood the weight of paths determined by circumstance rather than choice. February brought a surprise. After one Sunday session, as the other students were leaving, Margaret approached Henrik with unusual hesitation. "I have a favor to ask," she said, her voice low to avoid being overheard. "It's rather presumptuous, I'm afraid." "Ask," Henrik encouraged. "The worst I can do is say no." Margareta took a deep breath. "Next month marks my 45th year on the throne. There will be the usual public celebrations, speeches, a special session of Parliament." She paused. "And a private concert at the palace for family and close friends. I've been asked to play something, a tradition my father started where family members perform." Henrik's eyebrows rose in surprise. "You want advice on repertoire?" "More than that," Margaret said. "I would like you to coach me, specifically for this performance. Additional lessons beyond our Sunday sessions." Henrik considered the request. "That would mean coming to the palace, I presume?" "Yes. There's a music room with a magnificent Steinway that belonged to my grandfather. Security would be simpler that way." She hesitated. "I understand if it's too much to ask. You have other students, other commitments. What piece did you have in mind?" Henrik asked, already mentally rearranging his schedule. Relief washed over Margaret's face. "Chopin's Nocturne in E-flat major. It was my father's favorite." Henrik nodded, familiar with the piece, beautiful but challenging, requiring both technical skill and emotional depth. "When is the performance?" "March 18th, just over 5 weeks from now." "Then we should begin immediately," Henrik said decisively. "The Nocturne requires delicate phrasing. We'll need at least 2 sessions per week in addition to Sundays." And so began a new chapter in their unusual relationship. Twice weekly, Henrik was collected by a discreet palace car and brought to a side entrance of the royal residence. Thomas would meet him and escort him through corridors lined with portraits and historical artifacts until they reached the music room. A beautiful space with perfect acoustics, tall windows overlooking the palace gardens and the promised Steinway grand piano, its tone as magnificent as its appearance. During these sessions, they worked intensively on the Chopin Nocturne. Henrik was a demanding teacher, no less exacting for his students' royal status. He corrected her timing, refined her pedaling technique, insisted on precisely the right touch for each phrase. "No, No, he would say, shaking his head. You're rushing the middle section. This passage should float like a dream within a dream. Or your left hand is too prominent here. It should support the melody, not compete with it. Margaret accepted every criticism without complaint, practicing passages repeatedly until Henrik nodded his approval. Her dedication impressed him, especially knowing that these lessons often came after long days of royal duties. Sometimes, when she needed a break, they would talk. The music room, unlike the formal staterooms elsewhere in the palace, had a comfortable intimacy that encouraged conversation. Henrik learned more about her life, the constant balance between public duties and private moments, the weight of representing a nation, the subtle art of being a constitutional monarch in the modern age. People think it's all ceremonial now, she told him during one such interlude, that we merely cut ribbons and wave. They don't see the diplomatic work, the careful maintenance of relationships, the need to remain politically neutral while staying informed on every issue. It sounds exhausting, Henrik commented. It can be, she acknowledged, but it's also a privilege to be part of something larger than oneself, to maintain traditions while helping them evolve. She smiled wryly, not unlike classical music perhaps. As the weeks passed, the nocturne took shape under their combined efforts. Margaret's playing grew more confident, more nuanced, the piece becoming not just technically proficient, but personally meaningful. During their final coaching session before the performance, Henrik sat quietly as Margaret played the nocturne from beginning to end without interruption. When the last note faded, he remained silent for a moment, struck by how far she had come since that first Sunday when she had walked anonymously into his classroom. Well? She asked, her hands resting lightly on the keys. It's ready, Henrik said simply. You're ready, Margaret exhaled slowly. Thank you. Not just for the coaching, but for treating the music and me with such honesty. Henrik nodded, understanding what she meant. In a world where people often treated her with deference, genuine criticism was a rare gift. I have something for you, she said, reaching for an envelope on top of the piano, an invitation to the performance. It's a small gathering, just 40 people or so, very informal by palace standards. Henrik took the envelope, surprised and touched by the gesture. I would be honored. The invitation says Professor Henrik Larsson and guest, Margaret added casually. Should you wish to bring someone? Henrik thought briefly of Lisa from the music center, who would undoubtedly be thrilled by such an opportunity, but then shook his head. Just myself, I think, but thank you. On the evening of March 18th, Henrik found himself in the strange position of approaching the palace's main entrance as an invited guest. He wore his best suit, 20 years old but well-maintained, and carried the invitation in his pocket, still somewhat disbelieving of the situation. A uniformed guard checked his name against a list and directed him to a reception room where other guests were gathering before the private concert. Henrik recognized a few faces from newspapers and television, members of the royal family, government ministers, distinguished artists and musicians. He felt decidedly out of place until Thomas appeared at his elbow. Professor Larsson, he said with a nod that was almost friendly. Her Majesty asked me to ensure you were comfortable. May I get you something to drink? Just water, thank you, Henrik replied, grateful for the familiar face. She's nervous, Thomas confided, his professional reserve slipping slightly. I've never seen her concerned about a public appearance before, but this performance seems different. Henrik understood. Playing music exposed a vulnerability that official duties did not. She'll be magnificent, he said with certainty. Soon they were ushered into a small concert hall within the palace. Henrik was seated in the second row, close enough to see the details of the magnificent grand piano positioned center stage. A hush fell over the gathering as a palace official welcomed everyone and explained the tradition of family performances to commemorate significant royal anniversaries. When Margaret entered, Henrik barely recognized her. Gone was his plainly dressed piano student, replaced by a monarch in a simple but elegant evening gown, wearing a modest tiara that caught the light as she moved. She acknowledged the guests with a gracious nod, then took her place at the piano. For a brief moment before she began playing, her eyes found Henrik in the audience. He gave her an almost imperceptible nod, their private signal from rehearsals that everything was in place, that she was prepared. Then her fingers touched the keys, and the room filled with Chopin's Nocturne. Henrik held his breath, hearing in her playing all the hours of practice, all the corrections and refinements, but also something more, an emotional quality that transcended technique. She was telling her own story through Chopin's notes, communicating something deeply personal to the audience. When she finished, there was a moment of profound silence before applause filled the room. Henrik saw several people discreetly wiping away tears, moved by the unexpected depth of feeling from their monarch. Margaret acknowledged the applause with dignity, her eyes once again finding Henrik's for the briefest moment, a silent thank you from student to teacher. The reception that followed was elegant but surprisingly relaxed. Henrik found himself approached by various guests curious about his connection to the Queen. He explained simply that he was her piano teacher, offering no details about the Sunday workshops or their private lessons. Eventually, Margaret made her way to him, surrounded by an almost invisible perimeter of security. "Professor Larson," she said formally, for the benefit of those nearby, "I'm so pleased you could attend." "The performance was beautiful, Your Majesty," Henrik replied with equal formality. Chopin himself would have been moved. A hint of their usual rapport flickered in her eyes. High praise from such a demanding teacher. Later, as the evening wound down and guests began to depart, Margaret found a moment to speak with Henrik more privately. "Will I see you on Sunday?" she asked. "Of course," Henrik replied. "We're starting Beethoven's sonatas with the class. Your nocturne was splendid, but there's always more to learn." Margaret smiled, clearly pleased by his answer. "Always more to learn," she agreed. "That's what keeps life interesting, isn't it?" As Henrik left the palace that night, walking through gates that had once seemed an impassable boundary between his world and hers, he reflected on the strange turn his life had taken. Somehow, through the universal language of music, an ordinary piano teacher and an extraordinary queen had found common ground, each helping the other remember something essential about themselves beyond the roles they played in the world. Spring arrived in Copenhagen, bringing longer days and the first tentative blossoms to the city's parks and gardens. Henrik's Sunday workshops continued, with Margaret attending as regularly as her schedule allowed. After her palace performance, she seemed more relaxed in class, as if having shared her music in such a personal way had freed something within her. The dynamic of their unusual friendship had settled into a comfortable pattern. On Sundays, she was simply another student in his class, albeit one whose car and security detail waited discreetly outside. Occasionally, when royal duties permitted, they still held private lessons at the palace, working on more challenging pieces that Margaret wanted to explore. One sunny Sunday in April, Henrik arrived at the music center to find an official-looking envelope in his faculty mailbox. Inside was a formal invitation to a state dinner honoring visiting musicians from around the world. A handwritten note in Margaret's elegant script was paperclipped to the invitation. "The palace protocol office will be horrified, but I thought you might enjoy meeting Maestro Yamamoto from Tokyo. His interpretations of Beethoven rival your own." Henrik smiled, touched by her thoughtfulness. In the months since she had first appeared in his classroom, she had come to know his musical tastes and heroes with remarkable precision. Maestro Yamamoto was indeed someone Henrik had long admired from afar. The state dinner was unlike anything Henrik had experienced. Palace staff had provided detailed instructions on protocol, when to bow, how to address various dignitaries, which fork to use for which course. He felt distinctly out of place among ambassadors and renowned musicians in his rented tuxedo, but whenever discomfort threatened to overwhelm him, he reminded himself that he had been invited for a reason. Music was his passport into this world, just as it had been Margaret's passport into his. During the dinner, he was seated far from the Queen as protocol dictated, but near enough to Maestro Yamamoto to engage in conversation. The Japanese conductor was warm and unpretentious, eager to discuss interpretation of the German masters with a fellow enthusiast. "Her Majesty speaks very highly of your teaching," Yamamoto said at one point, surprising Henrik. "She mentioned that you have helped her rediscover her love of piano." "She is a dedicated student," Henrik replied diplomatically. Yamamoto smiled knowingly. "It is rare for those in her position to submit themselves to instruction. It suggests both wisdom and humility." Later in the evening, after the formal dinner concluded and guests moved to an adjacent salon for coffee, Margaret made her way to Henrik's side. In this setting, she was every inch the queen, regal in a blue gown with a diamond tiara and orders of state. Yet when she spoke, he heard the voice of his piano student. "Are you surviving the protocol?" she asked with a hint of amusement. "Barely," Henrik admitted, "though I haven't spilled anything on the tablecloth, which I count as a victory." "And Maestro Yamamoto? Was he everything you hoped?" "More. He's invited me to attend rehearsals when his orchestra performs in Copenhagen next season." Margaretta's face lit up. "Wonderful. I thought you might enjoy meeting him." She glanced around the room, then added in a lower voice, "This is my world, Henrik. Sometimes beautiful, often exhausting, occasionally meaningful. Thank you for venturing into it tonight." Before he could respond, she was called away by an aide, some diplomatic necessity requiring her attention. Henrik watched her go, struck by the contrast between this official version of Margaret and the woman who sat at his piano each Sunday, working through difficult passages with determined concentration. As spring deepened into summer, a new development arose. The director of the music center approached Henrik after a faculty meeting. "The Ministry of Culture has reached out," she said, barely containing her excitement. "They're interested in expanding our community music program." "Significant funding, Henrik? They've specifically mentioned your piano workshop as a model." Henrik was surprised. "My workshop, why?" The director shrugged. "They mentioned something about music education being accessible to all citizens, regardless of background or status. Very democratic, very Danish." Henrik had a strong suspicion about the source of this sudden interest but said nothing. When he mentioned the development to Margaret the following Sunday, she maintained an expression of polite interest that didn't quite mask her satisfaction. "How fortunate," she said mildly. "The Ministry of Culture does excellent work." "Indeed," Henrik replied, giving her a knowing look. "Particularly when guided by royal suggestion?" Margaret's eyes twinkled, though her face remained innocent. "I couldn't possibly comment on the internal workings of government ministries. With the new funding came changes. The music center was able to purchase better instruments, offer more scholarships, extend its community outreach." Henrik found himself appointed lead coordinator for the expanded piano program, with a modest raise and reduced administrative duties to allow him to focus on teaching. Summer brought another change. During one of their palace lessons, Margaret mentioned an upcoming state visit to Japan. "I'll be away for 3 Sundays, she said as they worked on a particularly challenging Rachmaninoff prelude. "The Emperor has arranged a cultural program that includes several piano performances. I've been practicing extra hours." "Nervous?" Henrik asked. "A bit," she admitted. "Playing for other heads of state is different from playing for family." Henrik nodded, understanding. "Remember what we discussed about performance anxiety. The audience wants you to succeed. Focus on the music, not their expectations." Margaret smiled gratefully. Wise advice for music and for life. The 3 Sundays of Margaretta's absence felt strange to Henrik. The workshop continued, of course. Paul still brought Danish pastries. Astrid still played brilliantly and critiqued others mercilessly. Niels and Katrina, now married, still shared the piano bench as they worked on duets. But Henrik found himself glancing at the door at 2 o'clock, half expecting to see Margaret slip in. On the 4th Sunday, Henrik arrived early to prepare the classroom. As he arranged chairs, he heard a familiar voice behind him. "Do you have room for a returning student?" He turned to find Margaret standing in the doorway, dressed in her usual simple attire, though perhaps looking a bit tanned from the Japanese summer. "Always," Henrik replied, surprised by how glad he was to see her. "How was the state visit?" "Productive diplomatically. Exhausting personally," she smiled. "But I played Chopin for the Emperor and didn't embarrass Denmark, so I count it as a success." "Of course you didn't embarrass Denmark," Henrik said with mock severity. "I wouldn't allow a student of mine to do so." As other students began to arrive, greeting Margaret with genuine warmth, Henrik reflected on the strange journey of the past year. What had begun as an extraordinary encounter, a queen anonymously joining a community piano class, had transformed into something both more ordinary and more remarkable. A genuine connection between 2 people from vastly different worlds, united by music. The autumn brought a significant birthday for Henrik, his 60th. He had planned to let it pass without celebration, but arrived at the music center that Sunday to find the classroom decorated with balloons and a cake waiting on the piano. "Happy birthday, Professor," his students chorused as he entered. Henrik was touched, if slightly embarrassed by the attention. After thank yous and the obligatory cake cutting, the workshop proceeded normally. Only at the end, as students were gathering their belongings, did Margarete approach him with a small wrapped package. "It isn't much," she said, suddenly seeming unsure of herself. "But I thought you might like it." Henrik opened the gift carefully. Inside was an antique metronome, beautifully crafted of dark wood with brass fittings. A small plaque on its base read, "To Henrik, who teaches that time, properly measured creates beauty." "With gratitude, it belonged to my grandfather," Margaret explained. "He was an amateur composer, much better as a king than as a musician, I'm afraid. But he loved music with genuine passion." Henrik ran his fingers over the smooth wood, understanding the personal significance of such a gift. "Thank you," he said simply. "I'll treasure it." That evening, alone in his apartment, Henrik placed the metronome on his piano. He wound it carefully and set it ticking at a moderate andante. The steady rhythm filled the room as he began to play a piece he was composing, something he had returned to since meeting Margaret. After years of teaching without creating, the piece was taking shape slowly, its themes exploring the unexpected connections that life sometimes offers, between teacher and student, between ordinary and extraordinary, between lives that should never have intersected but somehow did. He had tentatively titled it Royal Lesson, though he wasn't entirely satisfied with the name. As autumn leaves fell and the days grew shorter, Henrik and Margaret continued their musical journey together. Her progress on the piano was remarkable, fueled by her natural talent and diligent practice. His growth was different but no less significant, a renewed passion for teaching, a return to composition, and a friendship that defied conventional boundaries. There were challenges, of course. Royal duties sometimes kept Margaret away for weeks. Protocol occasionally created distance that needed to be navigated carefully. The public eventually learned of the Queen's piano lessons, leading to media interest that threatened the workshop's peaceful atmosphere. But through it all, they maintained the core of what had brought them together, a shared belief that music transcended titles and positions, that in the language of notes and phrases they could speak as equals. One Sunday afternoon in late November, as early darkness fell over Copenhagen and the first snow of winter dusted the streets, Henrik's students performed their end-of-term recital at the music center. The event had grown from their small gathering at Henrik's apartment to a modest community concert, attended by friends, family, and music lovers from the neighborhood. Margaret performed last, playing the Rachmaninoff prelude they had worked on throughout the autumn. Her security detail remained discreetly present, but most of the audience had grown accustomed to the royal presence among them, focusing on the music rather than the musician's title. As the final notes faded and applause filled the room, Henrik caught Margaret's eye across the piano. In that moment of shared accomplishment, no words were necessary. They had each given the other a precious gift. She had reminded him why he became a teacher. He had helped her remember the simple joy of being a student. Music, like life, Henrik reflected, was not about reaching a perfect final chord, but about the journey of creating beauty from one note to the next, a journey best taken with those who hear the same melodies in their hearts.